Between 1800 and 1875, a new theme in it was developed by American writers. That theme was unique in literature. It belonged to America. That theme was concerned with the dynamic human drama of the Westward Movement. The movement began with the earliest crossing of the Alleghenies along the Cumberland Road and other trails. With later migrations on the long Santa Fe and Oregon trails, the movement reached a grand scale, and literature found an epic theme. That theme was the majestic American West and the men and women who peopled it. In his novel, The Covered Wagon, Emerson Hough tells of the movement.
It was properly a picture done on a vast canvas, that of the frontier, a picture of might, of inevitableness.
Like a slow-moving tide, these Americans swept westward, expanding the nation to fill the continent. The poetry of Joaquin Miller tells of this continent.
My plains of America, I turn to you, lean to you, lift you my hands.
The western plains, vast, untamed. The western mountains, rugged and grand. In the land itself, many American writers found inspiration for their works. Others turned to the human story of the Westward Movement, the story of the men and women who pushed back the frontier. And the frontier shifted, depending upon the time of the century. It might be in the forests of the Oregon country, or in the Middle West. Hamlin Garland, in his Son of the Middle Border, writes of the restless search for a better home.
In response to some powerful yearning call, my father was about to set out for the 5th time into the still more remote and untrodden West.
And before this, in the early 19th century, we find the frontier in the Ohio country. This might have been the home of the Luckett family, who live in the pages of Conrad Richter's novel, The Trees. Let's see it through the eyes of Mrs. Luckett, the pioneer mother.
She stared a long time across the doorsill. Then around the cabin room at the familiar slab stools and puncheon table. The hand-whittled loom and wheel. None of these things could they take along.
No, none of these things could they take on the journey into the Ohio wilderness, or wherever the Western Trail beckoned. Arthur Gitterman caught the flavor of this restlessness in his poem, I Sing the Pioneer.
As he roved Kentucky far and near, hunting the buffalo, elk, and deer, what joy to see, what joy to win so fair a land for his kith and kin, of streams unstained and woods unhewn. Elbow room, laughed Daniel Boone.
Yes, elbow room. A country was growing, and American writers were growing with it. Joaquin Miller wrote,
Room to turn round in, to breathe and be free.
Among the men who blazed the earliest trails to the West were the trappers and traders. Washington Irving, one of the early writers of the West, describes the trappers in his book, Captain Bonneville.
Perhaps no class of men on earth led a life of more continued peril, exertion, and excitement.
In their trapping and trading, these men ranged over the entire West. Their adventures and experiences furnished American writers with some of the earliest material for the literature of the West. Their tales, too, attracted the earliest settlers, the dauntless ones whose deeds furnished more inspiration for American writers. Joaquin Miller called them heroes of America.
I say such silent pioneers, who here set plowshare to the sun, and silent gave their sunless years, were kings of heroes, every one.
One of the first writers to see pioneers on the move was Francis Parkman. In his book, The Oregon Trail, Parkman tells of the emigrants, as he calls them.
They were in great confusion, holding meetings, drawing up regulations, and passing resolutions.
In a sense, the wagon trains were miniature democracies on the move. Emerson Hough also characterizes them.
We're taking church and state and home along with us, day by day, men. We're not just trappers and adventurers.
Homemakers, builders, and yet not without a trace of wanderlust. As one pioneer expresses it,
Besides, this country is too old, too long settled. I want the buffalo. I crave to see the plains, Molly, what real American does not.
and so they talked and dreamed of seeing the plains, of seeing Oregon, or Texas, or California. And they sang, too, of the homes they had left.
We're all going down the Cumberland Gap, Cumberland Gap, Cumberland Gap. We're all going down.
Songs that were old, and sights that were new, all part of the literature of the West. Indians furnished many themes for that literature. Francis Parkman, who lived for a time with the Indians, wrote keen observations of their way of life. Parkman and other writers preserved for us the stories of this kind of America that today has largely disappeared. Today, too, there are only empty ghost towns to remind us of another exciting theme in American literature: the discovery of gold in California in 1848. The gold rush of 1849 was an exciting chapter of American life that furnished boisterous action and many kinds of colorful characters for American writers. This period comes alive for us in the stories of Bret Harte, stories such as The Luck of Roaring Camp and The Outcasts of Poker Flat. The life of the miners was also observed by Mark Twain, who lived in this cabin near Sonora, California. He described the life he saw in his book, Roughing It. East of this cabin in California, where Mark Twain wrote, is Virginia City, Nevada, where young Twain also lived. He worked in this newspaper office as a reporter. The Territorial Enterprise was one of many frontier newspapers that were often the earliest means of expression for some of the writers of the West. Many writers of the American West have taken for their stories and poems the theme of the American cowboy. Charles M. Russell wrote,
The cowpuncher's home was big. It wasn't where he took his hat off, but where he spread his blankets.
In his book, The Virginian, Owen Wister created the young cowboy hero. He is an ideal who lives in many novels, including some of the present time. Not only individuals, but the broader themes of change and development were also material for writers. The change from raw frontier country to more settled farmland was traced by Bess Streeter Aldrich in her novel, A Lantern in Her Hand.
By 1880, the deep was all fenced. Every fence post was a signpost. They said, we have enclosed a portion of the old prairie. We hold between our wooden bodies the emblem of the progressive pioneer.
With the builders of fences and the makers of farmhouses, the Westward Movement drew to a close. The epic heritage of the pioneers was summarized by Abby Deal, heroine of A Lantern in Her Hand.
They were prophets, John. Prophets in a strange country. What a legacy they've left you all. Farms and cities. Cattle on 1,000 hills. Manufactories. Great educational institutions.
Abby Deal's lifetime spanned an exciting period of American life. Her spirit is the vigorous, steadfast spirit of all those men and women who made the great migrations, the Westward Movement, that became an endless source of America.